Well, hello, my name is Dion Devow, and I'm the Indigenous Engagement Specialist within the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. We're joined with Dr. Huon, who's an analyst here within ASPI, and we're doing a series of conversations called IndigiCyber Conversations as a part of our IndigiCyber and Defence program within the Australian Strategic Policy Institute to raise awareness, to promote the amazing work that's been done in the areas of IT, diplomacy. And today we have another amazing Aboriginal First Nations man, Damien Miller, who has had a long career in DFAT. He's currently based in Washington as Minister Counsellor for Strategic Communication within DFAT. He's had quite a number of postings whilst his career within DFAT is a role model for many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples across the country, but also Australians in general. He's also a lawyer. His country is in northern Queensland. He grew up in Brisbane. I've had the pleasure of knowing Damien for quite a long time and have watched in awe around with respect to his amazing career. And again, one of the things that we're trying to do within the Australian Strategic Policy Institute is really highlight the fact that we have this amazing cohort of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across the country working in amazing roles within different sectors in industry, IT, cyber, diplomacy, and Damien again is an excellent example of one of these incredible people, and his story is very, very interesting as well. Also, he's a lawyer, and we have lots of questions for him today that Huon and I will be asking, picking his brain about what and how he has come to where he is today in his career, and just a little bit about his story and his journey, and a bit about also his cultural heritage. Again, he's a proud First Nations man, and he joins us today. And we just want to welcome you, Damien, and thank you so much for your time. We understand you're busy. There's a bit of a time difference with you being overseas, and so we welcome the opportunity to speak to you this morning and hear a little bit about your story.
Thank you, Dion and Huon. Lovely to be with you. It's really great to be part of this conversation. I really congratulate ASPI on all the amazing work that you're doing in the Indigenous space, and wonderful to see you, Dion, in this role as well. So delighted to be part of the conversation, and really great to see what you're up to.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. And can we start, Damien, with you letting us know a little bit about your cultural history? Again, you're a very proud First Nations man with your family heritage and your country being in and around Queensland. We know that you grew up in Brisbane, but who is your country and where is your mob?
So my mob, my people are the Gungaloo people in central Queensland, so just outside of Rockhampton, for those who know that part of Queensland. And that's where my ancestral roots are, but my family, my father moved from central Queensland to Brisbane in the 1960s. But I think it's true to say for my family and many Indigenous families in Queensland, in central Queensland, North Queensland, we're all a bit of the product of the Aboriginal Protection Act in the early 1900s, which meant that many of our families were taken away from their traditional country and moved to reservations and stations, which is what happened to my grandmother and my family. And so I think there's a very large diaspora of Indigenous people from all over Queensland and who ended up in places like Brisbane or Palm Island or Cairns across the state. So, but I have a strong links right across Queensland, but particularly to central Queensland.
And how often is it, especially with your current career and where you are geographically, you've lived and worked overseas quite a lot of the times throughout your time working with DFAT. Do you get the opportunity to go back to your country much, or?
Not as much as I'd like. Whenever I go back, a lot of relatives are always saying, "Why are you overseas and why don't you come back and spend time?" But I think, I've been in DFAT for nearly 20 years and I've spent almost half of that time overseas. So my last couple of postings, my current postings in the United States, before that I was in Europe, and my first posting was in Asia. So it's been amazing to just see the world and to look at Australia from overseas and to promote and advocate for Australia. But it does mean there are costs, and one of the costs is that you're away from family and friends, and particularly away from your own country.
Yeah, well, it's again, your story is really incredible. You're an amazing role model and example of what can be achieved. And just wanted to ask you, can you tell us a bit about that personal journey? Your journey into diplomacy and the backgrounds and the skills that you needed to become to actually become an ambassador. I think that's really important for other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to hear what things that they can put in place and what skills they can work towards obtaining to follow in your footsteps and or even to pursue a role similar to yours.
Well, I grew up not knowing, having no connection to foreign policy or to DFAT. Although I was very early in my life, I found a little brochure from DFAT from the 1980s, and it said, if you're interested in the world and you want to win a future for Australia in the world, think about DFAT. And so it just sparked a bit of an interest from an early age in it. My father, who grew up in Queensland, was always interested in the world around and different cultures. So I think that rubbed off on me a bit. But the thing is, you might kind of hear about DFAT or hear about life in diplomacy, but getting there is another thing. I think you have to then do as well as you can do in high school, go on to university, and then from university, hopefully get into a graduate program in Canberra, and then sort of work your way through DFAT. So it's wonderful to know that there are over 100 Indigenous colleagues in the department now. I think when I joined in 1995 as a cadet, there was a handful of Indigenous employees in DFAT, but now it's really grown, and Indigenous people breaking all kinds of barriers in the department over that time. So we're a place that's really embraces our Indigenous staff and also really embraces Indigenous issues. And we have this Indigenous diplomacy agenda, which is important to us and to us as a whole department, but including for our Indigenous staff. So DFAT, like any organisation, has been on a journey over the last couple of decades, but it's I think we're in a very good place now.
And with the Indigenous diplomacy agenda, what is DFAT hoping to achieve with that?
A couple of things. There's 4 pillars to it, basically. So it's really about how can we ensure that Indigenous perspectives, Indigenous interests are reflected in our foreign policy, but also in our trade and economic policy, in our development policy, and also in our corporate work, how we attract and retain Indigenous employees. So we have had for many years a Reconciliation Action Plan. We previously had an Indigenous people strategy, but we've elevated it to an Indigenous diplomacy agenda. This was launched a couple of months ago, and it's really about that we as a department, we as a country want to make a difference in Indigenous space internationally, but we also want to create opportunities for Indigenous people in Australia to engage with the world. And it's something that I've seen up close for many years, and I've been a part of, to try and create space for Indigenous Australians to, for example, to come to Europe when I was there, to come and talk about issues that are important to our community, whether it's about economic development or reconciliation or national apologies or whatever the issues might be. It's about how can DFAT facilitate these conversations, create spaces, and allow Indigenous voices, or to make space for Indigenous voices internationally.
Well, if you think about, even Dion is here from the Torres Strait, and there's been a long history of relationship building with our near neighbours and Indigenous communities and our near neighbours. What do you think we can learn from that history? And it's really a history of diplomacy.
It really is. I know there's been some work done on, what is Indigenous diplomacy. And if you look back, as you said, into pre-1788, there were strong links between the Torres Strait and what's known as Papua New Guinea, but also in Arnhem Land with the Macassan people and with Indonesia. So there are these historic peaceful links between peoples, which are ancient, which were trade connections, and there were cultural connections, even some bits of language from the region into Australia that way. So I think we have a very long and proud history of Indigenous diplomacy. And I think one thing about being an Indigenous officer in DFAT is to be really, for me personally, I'm just so proud of our incredible culture and everything we've achieved and living on our continent peacefully and in touch with the natural environment for 60,000 plus years. That's an extraordinary story, and it's one that I'm very proud to share, and I know DFAT is as well.
And I know you've worked in soft power before, and so thinking about Indigenous, Australia's Indigenous culture as a part of that soft power. So how does this Indigenous diplomacy agenda enhance Australia's soft power? And if we don't do it well, what does that mean for us?
I think Australia's Indigenous heritage is something that we should be and are very proud of as a country. So it is a natural part of our soft power. A lot of people around the world, in my experience, may not know a lot about Indigenous Australia, but they have an interest in it. And they see it as a very unique culture in the world, the oldest continuous culture in the world, that's still very vibrant and rich and practices culture right across our country. But also we have Indigenous people who are excelling in law, in science, in medicine. So it's not just an ancient story, it's a very modern story about how we're engaging with the world. So all of that combined, I think sometimes, and media coverage internationally, there can be a focus on some of the deep challenges we can have in our communities, and we should acknowledge that. We talk about it openly and say that we're trying to find solutions as a government, but also in partnership with Indigenous people. So there, in any of these issues, there can be light and shade, and it's important to kind of be honest and open about our past and what we're trying to do to correct the past in partnership across the country, but also to celebrate who Indigenous people are today. And I think so. All combined says that Australia is an open, a mature country which explores the truth and wants to talk openly about our rich Indigenous heritage and where we are today.
And certainly one of the most pressing issues in our region is the issue of climate change, and certainly with our regional partners and friends. I'm just wondering, because Indigenous people across the globe are often they manage a lot of natural resources. So is there anything that we can learn from contemporary practices of resource management in Indigenous land management that can become a part of our foreign policy, if you like?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I said, Indigenous people have been living in tune with nature for thousands of years here on the Australian continent. So there's some incredible lessons right across the country. But also there are many Indigenous communities which are running their own pastoral leases. They're working with mining companies as well on the development of land. So it's a really complex and interesting story. But a great example of where DFAT or the Australian government has worked with Indigenous communities to promote some of these sustainable practices is really kind of the fire management techniques that are used, savanna burning techniques that are used in places like Broome and in the west of Australia. I mean, some of the practices there in fire management are really have been really kind of focused on traditional knowledge, but it's brought into the modern age, and it's ideas which actually don't just work in that part of Australia, but actually can work in other parts of the world. And the fire burning practices in that part of Australia have been taken and explored in Africa, and many communities there are saying that the practices in Australia match what they're doing as well. So that's a great example of ancient practice being brought into the modern world, and it's something we can take to the world.
Damien, I just wanted to ask you, you talked about the fact now that there's over 100 Aboriginal and Torres Strait or First Nations peoples working within different areas in DFAT. You've been there for 20 years now, and again, established a really amazing career. When you started, I mean, I remember back in the early 90s, you were won a national award for academic achievement. You were working in a law firm, then you ended up, applying and working in DFAT. And I can imagine back in that time, the numbers of Aboriginal people were pretty scarce within the department. You also talked about the fact that now DFAT has a RAP, which a lot of organisations do, and that definitely helps towards increased participation when it comes to, Aboriginal people in all areas within an organisation. And, especially now with diplomacy being on the agenda within the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, with respect to Indigenous people and bringing, our issues and our affairs and the fact that we are the oldest living culture in the history of mankind into the department, and seeing that as a real asset in terms of the work that we're doing internationally. It's a lot easier now, I think, for Aboriginal people to follow into your footsteps and work within the department. But when you were coming through, those things weren't really around, and so you didn't really have an easy path around doing this stuff. And I'd really like to hear about, the role that you played in your first engagement overseas, when I think you were in Denmark, and I can't remember the role exactly, the title, but I mean, that was an amazing thing for a First Nations person to do. I just am really interested to hear about some of the challenges or how you found the confidence and the strength to be able to, I suppose, just pursue this type of career, because it wasn't one that is, and still is today, one that's not really common when it comes to, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. That's a great question. I think I still remember the first day I walked in the front gates of DFAT and thought, wow, I've arrived at this place, and kind of what's it going to mean for me and my family and my community to be here, to have walked in the door. And I think something that's really kind of guided me through my whole career is just really thinking about the incredible opportunities that I've had that may not have been available to my father, to my grandmother, to others, and to just really know that you're there in your own capacity. I was there starting off as a very junior public servant, but I always felt that it is so critical that Indigenous people walk through these front doors and have a role in shaping Australia's foreign and trade policy. And I've always sort of felt that. You also feel the kind of the backing and the support of your community, wanting you to succeed as well. And of course, even though I came in the early 90s, I wasn't the first. There were people like Stephen Hagan and Olga Havnen and Robin Forrester and many other incredible people who kind of paved the way for me. So just a lot of, I think a lot of emotions were probably going through my mind when I first walked into DFAT. And then you, like any journey, there are always ups and downs, but I think DFAT has been an incredibly supportive place for me and for other Indigenous staff. And as I said, just the commitment to the Indigenous agenda, whether it's through the RAP or whether it's through this Indigenous diplomacy agenda and many other things that DFAT does, you feel welcome, you feel like you belong. And I think there can be a lot of a focus on diversity and numbers and things like that, but I think it's moving into the belonging space. Does the organisation feel like a place where you belong? And I've got to say that DFAT has always felt like that for me. And I know there are many other Indigenous young people who are now in school or university who are thinking about their future path. And I think DFAT is a really great place for them to consider if they want to travel the world, see the world, and help influence Australia's future through our foreign policy.
No, that's awesome. Thank you so much for that. I just really wanted to hear that, and it's encouraging to hear that there is opportunity and space for future Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to do exactly what you're doing. I think it's an amazing thing, and it's really, really nice to see what you've done in terms of paving the way for First Nations peoples within the department.
It's an amazing achievement.
So Damien, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. Your story is amazing, and we hope that it'll touch the lives of not just First Nations peoples here in our country, but the Australian other Australians in general. And we hope that you'll be able to come back home soon after all the pandemic stuff dies down, or maybe we'll come over and see you in Washington.
No, thank you so much, Dion and Huon, and really great to be part of this. And congratulations on the series and the work that you're doing at ASPI. It's really amazing. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Damien. Take care.
Thanks, Damien.